Hello, my name is Kyle Matthews. I'm Executive Director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. We're very pleased to have you on today to talk about an important issue. The issue is of COVID disinformation and the link between artificial intelligence and freedom of expression. So as part of our project supported by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, in particular by the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media, my colleagues and I are organizing a series of interviews called AI and COVID-19 Disinformation Initiative to look at different experts from across OSCE member states about what is going on. And we're really lucky today to have with us, we have Linda Slapakova. Linda is a bright mind in Europe. She's analysis at RAND Europe. Linda, very pleased to have you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So Linda, to start with, can you tell us a bit about your work? What are you focusing on in your work related to disinformation?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So again, just to introduce my background a little bit, I'm an analyst in the defense and security team at RAND Europe. And we work across a lot of different kind of issues related to security defense, and disinformation is certainly one of them as part of kind of a broader portfolio looking at emerging security threats and emerging information threats. So there's a couple of recent projects that I've been working on kind of related to disinformation. The one kind of fairly recent one was just looking at the use of machine learning to counter disinformation and to detect pieces of malign information on social media. The more recent project that we're now doing with the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office is focusing kind of on the broader context of human rights in the digital age. So touching up on the linkages between disinformation, misinformation, and then also, hateful crime, but also freedom of expression and privacy and data protections, and how you protect these rights kind of in a more holistic way in the digital age. And then the final project that I'll mention is just looking at the impact of emerging technologies on security defense, and how institutions, including governments, but also the private sector and civil society, can utilize emerging technologies in a better way to counter these different threats.
Linda, you're the perfect person to speak to. You're touching all the issues that I want to talk about. So maybe to start with, since we've had this COVID pandemic, have you seen any changes in disinformation online?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, the first thing that I'll mention is that this is just, I'm just speaking kind of from my own opinion and what I've observed in other research. We haven't actually conducted any research on the COVID-19 disinformation in particular. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly been kind of changes in the narratives that disinformation is kind of being spread through on social media and through different kind of hybrid media as well. So I think there's really good research that the EU is publishing through its initiatives on kind of how the narratives of disinformation have moved through, focusing on the outbreak of the virus in China, to then through a more kind of globalized focus on the responses of different institutions to the outbreak and to the pandemic itself, and then becoming again more localized and intersecting with kind of different sociocultural and socioeconomic issues in different regions. So I think it's been really interesting to observe kind of how the narratives that kind of disinformation is touching on are moving in line with narratives around the pandemic itself. So there you can see kind of these different linkages and how narratives of disinformation are evolving. I think there's also certainly been kind of changes in the tactics, and those kind of mature and evolve with the objectives of different actors for pursuing disinformation. But I think that the evidence base there is probably a little less robust, so I wouldn't be able to kind of share specific insights. But we know that disinformation is certainly kind of focused more on kind of fostering polarization in different communities, and touching again into different local issues, and then kind of incentivizing more polarized discourse. So there's certainly been some of that. I think gradually you'll also see kind of changes in the impact of the disinformation. But again, I think more broadly, the evidence base around the impact of disinformation is a little less robust than, for example, how we know that narratives of disinformation evolve. So we still don't know, for example, beyond kind of the impact of disinformation just by being spread and by reaching different communities and being spread kind of very widely through social media, what is the impact of disinformation on behavior? So, I mean, in the COVID-19 pandemic, you've seen, disinformation kind of incentivizing different kinds of behavior and potentially, also providing kind of a threat to human health, which is a really kind of unique instance where you're being able to kind of observe those impacts of disinformation. But again, kind of the more broader impacts on, for example, how this might undermine trust in institutions, that we're still not sure about. And I think that's going to take some time for researchers to figure out.
So Linda, so we're in this debate where people say AI causes information, but you can also use AI to counter disinformation. Based on your work, how do you see the intersection of AI and the disinformation field? Is it polarizing? Can it be used in a more efficient manner? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a really broad issue to unpack, and certainly, I think when you say that it's a bit of a polarizing topic, certainly we have to recognize that AI and any kind of emerging technology is a little bit of a double-edged sword when it comes to emerging information threats, for example. So and human rights in general, right? So you should recognize that AI and emerging technologies provide certain types of threats for human rights, and they certainly can kind of challenge the safeguards that that governments kind of provide for human rights online. And you can see that in the case of AI and disinformation, definitely. So we know that AI can, create more potent information threats, for example, through deepfake technology. I think that's a frequently cited example. But just, by nature of creating imagery or even text, synthetic text, that is more difficult to recognize, that is just more authentic, and thus, is a bit more threatening as an information threat than non-synthetic text would be. You can also kind of see more threats emerging just through kind of the democratization of emerging technologies. So, by kind of lowering the barriers for different types of actors to create more potent disinformation threats. And certainly with AI, you can also imagine that disinformation would be able to kind of spread more rapidly or reach more communities, just as it, empowers different types of actors. So I think that's kind of on the side of how AI might, augment disinformation efforts or create entirely new forms of disinformation that we have to be cognizant of. But as I said, for each of on this side of the story, you have to kind of also consider the other side and look at, how artificial intelligence and different techniques such as machine learning can then be used to counter disinformation, which in our research, what we've observed or what we've kind of concluded is it's almost a necessity, right? So disinformation and also misinformation, whether it's being spread kind of intentionally or not intentionally, it's spreading at such a scale that you have to almost consider, automation and these kinds of emerging technologies such as AI or machine learning to augment kind of human fact checking or the work of, different human organizations to detect pieces of malign information on social media, because the scale is just, so big. And also, if you look at kind of the issue of AI creating more realistic images or more authentic images, it becomes more difficult for human fact checkers to look at this information and actually, recognize whether it is authentic or synthetic text or images. So I think, by design, it's almost a necessity to consider, the potential use of AI and machine learning and these different emerging technologies in this space. And there's certainly kind of different options for doing that. And we've been looking at, developing kind of, or identifying different best practices in this case. Obviously, by design of, or by nature of being an emerging technology, artificial intelligence can best assist with kind of the technical responses to artificial intelligence. So detection being, the most kind of primary example. So, we know that you can use different artificial intelligence techniques such as machine learning, such as deep learning, to detect disinformation better. And there's different methods kind of in that spectrum of responses as well, which I won't go into detail about. But in practice, that's already been starting. Kind of platforms as well as governments have started to implement that. And that ranges from, for example, Facebook is a good example. Facebook has mainly relied still on kind of human fact-checking organizations. And I think Facebook partners with about 60 organizations to detect disinformation. But you have human fact-checkers kind of identifying disinformation, and then you have an AI model kind of take over the process and identify similar pieces of disinformation, by which, then automatically you can kind of detect disinformation faster and also better by just detecting kind of similar pieces of disinformation on social media. So I think, again, you've already kind of start seeing in practice that artificial intelligence and machine learning are incredibly strong tools and potent tools to be used in this context. But obviously, kind of the story has to go beyond just detection, because we know that technical responses to disinformation are just not really enough, right? So you want to look at the broader context of responses to disinformation and how this can inform broader resilience building approaches. So not just kind of from this perspective of strengthening the resilience of institutions to be able to detect disinformation or counter disinformation, but also resilience of civil society to kind of being able to recognize pieces of disinformation, for example, through media literacy programs. And I'm happy to go into a bit more detail about that.
Well, Linda, I think you touched upon it. You talked about the positive side of AI, but some of the negative side, deep fakes, and you also, I think right firmly said there's so much data online that we need AI to deal with this. I'm wondering if you could maybe get in a little bit more detail and help us understand that encountering disinformation online, what priority should be given to protecting freedom of expression as a fundamental human right? Because we're seeing sometimes people taken offline, AI doesn't understand someone's joke, or how important is the issue of freedom of expression as a fundamental human right in the online space?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's ultimately when you consider the issue of disinformation and the issue of protecting freedom of expression, it's almost two sides of the same coin, right? And it's kind of the same story when you look at what are you actually trying to achieve by countering disinformation. You're trying to protect human rights. You're trying to protect democratic freedoms. You're trying to foster, stronger democratic institutions and actually, foster legitimate forms of discourse. So I think by design, you have to consider the issue of freedom of expression when you're considering different responses to disinformation. And I think there's certainly, responses out there that have been doing that already. And there's governance mechanisms and different forms of regulation that are just approaching the issue of countering disinformation automatically, kind of from the perspective of you have to ensure sufficient safeguards for freedom of expression online. And you can look at these issues also from the perspective of direct impacts of disinformation. So we know that for example, traditional cybersecurity threats kind of focus mainly on big actors or government actors, but also increasingly you're seeing cyber attacks on journalists or cyber attacks on civil society organizations. So and that can take the form of targeted disinformation campaigns as well. So those are the kind of direct impacts of disinformation of freedom of expression that you can address, and again that shows you kind of how big of a priority that should really be. But then there's also, of course, kind of the more indirect impacts that, and you mentioned a good example of that just by, artificial intelligence and machine learning models not really being able to detect, legitimate forms of speech too well. And certainly one of the kind of best practices or priorities for future research that we've identified is just improving the ability of AI models to recognize contextual nuance and being able to, match the potency of artificial intelligence models with human understanding of context. And so, that's one way that's one aspect where artificial intelligence models have to kind of evolve and they have to mature in that way. But you can then also kind of focus on improving, for example, the capacities of journalists to use machine learning models to fact check their information and empowering kind of legitimate forms of expression and legitimate forms of discourse in that way.
So my last question to you, Linda, is you talked a bit about best practices that you were studying, but what is the role for governments in this? In order to deal with disinformation but safeguard freedom of expression, are there certain things that government should be doing? Is it regulating tech companies? Is it doing public audits of algorithms? What do you think are some of the essential things government should be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, governments have a really major role in all of this, right? And it just depends on which aspect of responses you're looking at. So I think, again, using kind of the differentiation between when you look at a supply side of information, so that, that concerns both, journalists and like how journalists produce content, but also platforms that you mentioned. So I think, in that aspect, governments have, a really important role to regulate in different ways, right? So that doesn't have to be only kind of the hard type of regulation, but also softer regulation approaches. So strengthening cooperation with platforms and actually identifying, how platforms can kind of shape their codes of conduct or different standard setting behavior in a way that then protects freedom of expression and different human rights as well. So I think there's certainly a role for governments in kind of guiding the behavior of platforms in that way. And then also, as I mentioned, kind of strengthening the capacity of journalists and different stakeholders to actually kind of safeguard their freedom of expression while at the same time countering the spread of disinformation. But then looking at kind of the demand side of information or of the information environment, you're looking at, the role of civil society, and that ranges from individual end users to civil society organizations. And there, again, government has almost a responsibility to strengthen the resilience of the demand side of the information environment through, improving the capacity of end users or civil society organizations to navigate different forms of information and counter disinformation, including through media literacy programs or digital literacy programs. But again, also, strengthening the technical capacities of civil society organizations or human rights organizations.
So Linda, I want to really thank you for sharing your expertise. You touch upon so many deep issues that governments and NGOs and international organizations are struggling with. Linda from the RAND Europe, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.